How are you?
Good.
Doing
Today
good?
I'm good.
Today we're good. So just started the recording too. I'm going to fill a little bit of time just to give Facebook a chance to notify everybody that we are live and that we're here. So talk a little bit about Warwick's for a minute. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Warwick's, maybe you're joining us from some other part of the country, we have this is unusual. All three of us today are in California. So usually I have somebody from, let's see, the other night I had somebody that was actually in Paris that joined us on an event. So we cover the globe here at Warwick's now in virtual, in the virtual world, but Californians unite here. Even though you might not be natives, we still are all considered Californians now, right? So Warwick, speaking of Warwick's and native and how long we've been here, and Bill and I were talking in the green room about this, is Warwick's is actually celebrating its 125th anniversary this year. And while we are not the oldest bookstore in the country, we are the oldest continuously family-owned bookstore. So Nancy was, that's one of our little monikers there. Nancy Warwick is the great-granddaughter of the founding father of Warwick's. He started in Minnesota, came out here in the 30s. It's one of those things I like to say is smart man. He knew his location. And we've been in the building that we're at right now since the 50s. So we are known in San Diego for bringing wonderful authors to you. So we welcome you, Bill, to the wonderful, all of the authors that we've hosted here at Warwick's. And I think you might have frozen up, Bill, for a second. I'm hoping that you're back with us. And Dave, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay.
All looks
Bill?
good from here.
Bill, are you
Looks
there
good
with us
from
still?
here, too. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Okay, just came back. Okay, so tonight I'm going to be putting Bill's book into the comment section. So if you are in the San Diego area, you can choose to come and pick that up, but we can also ship it to you. I know those of you that have watched me before on this, I always like to say any way there is to get a book, you can get it from Warwick. So we will satisfy all of your book needs if need be. There's also a way for you to participate today. If you have a question, go ahead and put that into the comment section. Bill and David are going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then I'll bring in the questions from Facebook after they're done talking. So don't be shy and get your questions in there, and we will bring them to them after their conversation, which is going to be a great one tonight. Can't wait. So with that, I'll get the show rolling here and do a quick intro of these two wonderful gentlemen and then toss it to them. So William M. Arkin, also known as Bill, we're going to call you Bill tonight, is one of America's premier military experts. His investigative work has appeared on the front pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, and has won many awards. He served as an NBC news analyst and reporter for 30 years and is the best-selling author of more than a dozen books, including Top Secret America and the forthcoming History in One Act, a novel of 9/11. Bill served in Army intelligence in West Berlin during the Cold War and has been a consultant to wide-ranging organizations, including the U.S. Air Force, the United Nations Secretary General, Human Rights Watch, and the Natural Resource Defense Council. And he lives right here. He's a neighbor right here in Encinitas. So we're going to talk today about the recently released The Generals Have No Clothes, the untold story of our endless wars. With him today is David Peterson. David is a historically minded socioculture anthropologist with a joint degree in both disciplines. His research has been concerned with understanding better the material and meaningful reorganization of the hemispheres of the Americas, especially with regard to the influence of the United States. With that, gentlemen, have a wonderful conversation. See you in about a half hour.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you very much, Julie. Well, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with Bill Arkin. I'll just say that I met Bill in 1988, before the end of the Cold War. And I had studied for a period in Germany, and in that long time ago, and in that context, had gotten involved with student groups that were being very critical of US nuclear strategy in relation to NATO. And then when I ended up in Washington, D.C., I met Bill Arkin, and this was his expertise, and he had actually contributed significantly to exactly these debates that I was involved in as a young student. So Bill was always a wonderful interlocutor, and he's admirable as someone who can argue with all kinds of seemingly more powerful people. And it's a real art that he carries. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Bill. And I have some general comments and questions about your book, Bill. But I also, would like to give you a moment to give a general introduction, if you like.
Thanks, Dave. And thank you to Warwick's for hosting this event. The General Has No Clothes is it's an essay, a long essay that kind of derived from my resignation from NBC News in early 2019. And my frustration at NBC was that there was very little coverage of the actual wars that we were fighting around the world. And I wanted to bring attention to the fact that Donald Trump was sucking all the oxygen out of the world. And but that it was really the responsibility of the news media to cover the news, and that Donald Trump wasn't everything, and that we were fighting in, at the time, about 15 countries around the world. Now it's 21. And, there were days that went by when there was no news whatsoever about anything going on in any of these wars around the world. And when I was asked to expand that resignation letter into a book, I had to really conceptualize what it was about this current era, what it was about perpetual war itself, as I call it, that was different, and also what made it so resilient. I mean, we're now 20 years after 9/11, and so the question really has to be asked: how the hell are we still fighting, and why? And it's funny that Dave brings up nuclear weapons and the fact that I was a nuclear weapons expert in the 1980s, but part of my expertise at that time was identifying what was called the nuclear infrastructure, where the nuclear weapons were deployed all over the world, and conceptualizing the whole concept that there was an infrastructure behind nuclear weapons that drove much of what happened regarding nuclear weapons, that there was theory, but that there was also practice, and that practice was practiced every day, that nuclear weapons moved around the world, that nuclear weapons actually had an existence, that people were needed to tend to them, etc. They weren't just something that existed on paper. And so when I started to think about perpetual war, I think I applied the same methodology and the same idea, that there was an infrastructure of perpetual war, that there was a perpetual war machine, and that machine was made up of kind of a network, if you will, of communications, of intelligence, a network that was global in nature, and one that the United States had really built up and perfected since 9/11. One that allowed the US to fight in Afghanistan one day and fight in Burkina Faso and in Africa the next day. And in fact, even allowed the same people to do that fighting, because so much of what we call fighting was actually done from keyboards all around the planet. People collecting the intelligence, analyzing the intelligence, conducting the targeting, etc. That's the perpetual war machine. And I wrote about that because it seemed to me that that was like the essential underpinning of understanding why we can fight forever, and why we seem to be willing to fight forever, because it has become so efficient that it also has minimized the human resources that are required. And so for every soldier that's out there in the field, for every soldier that's on the ground in Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or more obscure countries, the truth of the matter is there are thousands of soldiers and thousands of technicians and thousands of contractors who are behind them in the United States, in the Middle East, in Europe and elsewhere, who are providing sort of the back end of perpetual war. And that this back end is what is both so resilient and so invisible, And that's what perpetuates its existence. It's a juggernaut. There's no one in charge. There's no real hub or center. And it's uniquely American because no other country has this type of global infrastructure. And in fact, even every country in NATO that supposedly fights with the United States is completely dependent upon the American network in order to fight. It needs the American network to communicate. It needs the American network to collect intelligence and receive intelligence. It even needs the American network to operate its own weapons. So it's really this sort of overwhelming capability, and that's what this book is about.
Bill, the historian in me wants to pose a question. It's at the center of your book, and I just wondered if you could draw it out. You know, you're really talking about a new post-Cold War national security context, system, world. And I think readers will be surprised to find out the contours of this new world. I certainly was. It's not binoculars looking over the Fulda Gap. It's much more complex. And I wonder if you could explain just some of the basic lineaments of this new system and why it's different from a previous period. And then,
well, you know, the main reality of today is that there's no front. You know, there's no front and there's no enemy. I mean, when we're talking about perpetual war, we're talking about maybe Al-Qaeda, maybe ISIS, maybe the Taliban, and in parts of Africa, we're talking about lesser organizations like Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram in West Africa. But there's no front. There's no singular mission. We're first and foremost, I think, trying to stop another 9/11 from occurring. And so in some ways you could say, well, we've been successful doing that, but we've also in the process of that manufactured hundreds of thousands of terrorists, and organizations like ISIS didn't even exist in 9/11. So we are also, by virtue of our occupation of much of the world, creating more terrorists than we are actually eradicating. But more important, I don't want to get into merely the arithmetic of it. It's more important that we recognize that we're not building greater stability or security. I mean, even Joe Biden in announcing that the United States was withdrawing its troops from Afghanistan couldn't promise that there was going to be stability. Couldn't say to the American people that Al-Qaeda had been eradicated, that the Taliban had been decimated, that this country was more secure or stable. In fact, it's a basket case, as is many of the places where we're fighting. So one has to ask both what we're achieving in this fighting, but ultimately, in order to ask the real question of what we should be doing, one has to recognize that it is this sort of post-Cold War machine that is a machine in itself that doesn't look like the Cold War, but yet is the sort of organizing principle, if you will, of national security worldwide. And that organizing principle of national security worldwide it has its own power, has its own autonomy, has its own practices, its own office politics, its own everything. And all of those things influence its continuation. I don't think I would argue that this is intentional on the part of those who fight. I don't think that they said to themselves in some deep think tank or chamber of the Pentagon, let's make perpetual war this invisible and resilient entity. But they got there over 20 years because the American public has no appetite for casualties, has no real appetite even for decimating the enemy. I mean, the irony of fighting in Afghanistan after 9/11 was that we essentially continued to apply the same soft touch to warfare that we had done during the Clinton years. So here you had the Bush administration essentially saying ABC, anything but Clinton. We were going to do things completely different. But even after 9/11, the way the American military operates, the American way of war, was able to persist, and it persists till today.
You mentioned, the role of different presidents and the American public and the media. And, I can say, I grew up thinking that these are more or less independent forces and independent actors that, can make things happen in the world in certain ways. And you're describing this, you use the word juggernaut, and I think I remember reading that, certainly thinking it as I was reading the book. It's kind of this system that has this kind of deep logic that nobody is consciously following, but this is the outcome. And the actual achievement of security is constantly deferred. That's it's the and so I don't know. It's and actually I was thinking the different chapters in the book show fascinating cases where one would think that there are certain forces, social groups, actors, agents that could kind of intervene and steer things a certain way. And you show somewhat relentlessly how this deep logic or internal logic of the system pushes it on. Um, it's yeah, it's an amazing story. And
Well, so let's talk about the issue of sort of what we're achieving, because it's really the bottom line. I liken perpetual war to the war on drugs. I like that comparison. We fight, 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 and the availability of illegal drugs never seems to diminish. And no one ever really seems to ask the question, why are we fighting if we can't eradicate drugs? So then people say, well, we need to address the root causes of why people take drugs, and then we don't address those root causes, or we certainly don't put the same amount of resources into eradicating the use of illegal drugs that we do in putting into the war on drugs. Well, that's very similar in perpetual war. We fight, 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 and the measure of success is, did anybody die today? And if no Americans died today, then we have success. And if nobody got run over by a truck or nobody got killed by the enemy, then it's a successful day. And I know that it's not meant to take away from the bravery of those few who are out there fighting. It's certainly not meant to take away from the 7,000 Americans who have been killed, American soldiers who have been killed, and the 53,000 who have been injured, and the thousands more who are suffering from PTSD and traumatic brain injury. But the truth of the matter is that what we've seen as an example in Joe Biden's announcement of the withdrawal from Afghanistan is how many veterans have spoken up about the fact that they feel cheated, that they feel that they've wasted their time, that they've wasted their energy, that they've wasted their years of fighting because the United States is withdrawing without any kind of victory, without any kind of conclusion. And that's going to now happen, I would imagine, in Iraq and Syria as well. Now, the system has migrated on. The system, if you will, is bored with Afghanistan and Iraq and is now moving on to other places. That's sort of the beauty of the whole thing. So just like the war on drugs, fentanyl and opioids becomes the drug that then has to be pursued, and maybe cocaine becomes less the drug that has to be pursued. Well, that's the role that Niger and Somalia and Yemen and Mali play in the perpetual war system, that they have new places that they can move on to. But overall, what's really disturbing to me, or what I brought attention to because I came at it from the standpoint of looking at the role of the news media, was that how much the American public was also divorced from the effort. Fewer and fewer people serve in the military. Fewer and fewer people have any association with the military, even in a place like San Diego. And the truth of the matter is that most Americans, their hair isn't mussed in any way by the fact that we're at war, and that on any one day we could be bombing in any one of 21 countries. Nobody's life is affected, really. Most people's lives are not affected. And even the economy is not affected. I mean, you think about words like military industrial complex and defense industry, and you think that they got to be behind all of this. But the truth of the matter is that we're not producing very much anymore. I mean, maybe there's a dozen ships that are under construction in the United States for the Navy. Maybe we're producing a couple of hundred fighter aircraft a year for the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. I mean, that is the production that is done in a year of the defense industry. And I'm telling you right now that that's what we produced in a day during World War II, when we were producing thousands of airplanes a year, thousands of tanks, of ships, etc. So each battleship, each arsenal, each Battlestar Galactica that we operate with today is so much more capable. It's hard to explain to people who aren't familiar with the military history that, yeah, we only have 100 operational bombers today, but every one of those bombers can do what 1,000 bombers couldn't do in World War II. They can fly out intercontinentally and hit dozens of targets and hit them accurately and with great precision. And in World War II, hardly 5% of the bombers sent out to hit their targets were able to do so. And we're talking about thousands that were flying. And so this efficiency and the technology behind it it makes for a beautiful machine, and yet at the same time makes for really an invisible machine, because the human resources that are required to sustain it are either just not needed anymore, or they're so opaque that people don't even realize that they're being used for military purposes, because the military today relies so much more on civilian technologies. That is, relies upon the internet, relies upon satellites, relies upon other technologies that are civilian in nature.
You use a buzzword that's well known now, but again, when I make the comparison back to the Cold War and an earlier period, the idea that a network was what everything was all about, that's really come to the fore now, and it plays a role in the book. And you showed features of this network, and the idea that national security is this incredibly complex network that itself is also chasing after other networks and trying to thwart other networks. And that's very different from thinking of, mechanized troops moving across territory, or what I remember was different throw weights and all these different calculations for, how fast your missiles and warheads can get into the air and the probability of them hitting. So could you say more about this network model that you're...
Well, again, as I've said, it's American. It's the only one that exists that's global in nature. It allows the United States to essentially communicate, sense, operate anywhere in the world. Think about the mountains of Afghanistan. There's not a plug to plug anything into. There's no electrical power. So everything that's brought to the mountains of Afghanistan has to have its own power sources. And so that means that the military has spent billions of dollars on improving batteries and decreasing the size and weight of those batteries in order to allow special operations forces to carry their own power with them. And then you have to think, okay, you're in the mountains of Afghanistan. Well, there's no communications. There's no cell phone towers. There's no military communications network. It's all dependent upon the internet. It's all dependent upon the global communications infrastructure. And to access that global infrastructure demands certain military appliances, either drones flying ahead that are sort of the node that connects the soldier on the ground to the internet, or satellites high above that do the same job. But in order to get thousands of people into the mountains, and all of them having an ability to communicate and to receive intelligence and to produce intelligence without power, without communications, demands that a very high bandwidth network that has been created. And it's been created ironically, from the beginning, to operate in one of the most remote parts of the world, which was the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan. So the network that was created to fight in 2001 is a spectacular network to then therefore be able to fight in Africa, because it is already mastered the question of being able to go places where there's no electrical power and there's no communications infrastructure. So the network has become this magnificent thing that facilitates the warfare itself. Without that power, without that internet connection, I know it sounds crazy, but probably most soldiers in the US military today would not know how to communicate, would not know how to read a map, would not know how to operate. They're completely dependent upon this fail-safe network. And the maintenance of that fail-safe network is actually the preponderance of activity that goes on within the American military.
You use the word activity, and that's a word that appears throughout the book. And you kind of say, the activity is the goal. It's not activity in the name of something else. And by the end of the book, one gets the sense that ostensibly security is the goal, but we never arrive there. But we sure have a lot of activity along the way.
I mean, look, the truth of the matter is that the goal has become very distant. And partly that is that we're 20 years into it. And in that 20 years, technologies have improved and technologies have matured. Let's remember in 2001, there was not an armed drone. This is an invention of the global war on terror. And it wasn't until really 2008 or so, the last year of the Bush administration, that the US had drones that were reliable enough to be able to say that if we send that drone out to kill Dave Peterson, we're actually going to be able to find him and kill him. And that's what Obama inherited. So no wonder Obama became then the drone killing president, because that was the capability that had been created in the previous 8 years. And there were so many other similar types of technologies, satellite guided bombs, and again, the internet connectivity and these big data databases. And then of course, the one that's most important is precise mapping of the planet, so that when you find somebody, you know exactly where they are with a geographic coordinate, because that geographic coordinate is what guides the bomb. It's no longer lasers that guide the bombs or televisions or electro-optical systems. It's the geographic coordinate. So if I'm able to, with enough range, to literally launch a weapon from a bus, that weapon will find the target, because the weapon itself contains the seeker that is able to guide to the coordinate. So the actual delivery platform even becomes kind of irrelevant. And that it's just such a technological shift and change from what once was. And understanding that network, understanding this system, I say in the book, is not really the forte of the Pentagon. I mean, there are magnificent, great soldiers who know their jobs very well, but they are definitely operating in the trees and not in the forest. And there are very few people who have a big picture understanding of what this overall war system is. And so that also makes it difficult to assess whether or not it's being successful, because people tend to say, I did my job today and I did it well. And maybe all these people did do their job today and did it well, but does it equal the outcome that you want to have, either eradicating terrorism, creating greater security or stability? And I say the answer is no, that there's not one country in the Middle East or Africa today that is safer than it was in 2001. And that in itself should be enough for most people to say, well, then there's got to be something wrong, because we are not creating greater stability and greater security.
I want to make sure we get to the some of the concluding points in your book, and especially what you point out that how would one actually measure security? We have GNP, we have all kinds of measures that are proxies for all kinds of social development, social organization, and so forth. But how could we sort of make this end result visible or not? And I also wanted to sort of note there's another conundrum here in that so much of these technologies and network infrastructure and stuff that you talk about, it's immediately visible that they have civilian implications, and huge amounts of money are being made in these domains. As you said, it's not like building aircraft. It's a completely different realm.
Yeah. I mean, it should be pointed out, that probably half of the 10 largest defense contractors produce nothing but PowerPoint briefings. So we're talking about multi-billion-dollar a year companies that don't produce bullets, don't produce tanks, don't produce airplanes, don't produce missiles. They produce software, and they produce code, and they produce recommendations, and they produce policies, and they produce intelligence. And that really is the first shift that's occurred. So you ask a question about, like, how do we measure this, or how would we measure this if we wanted to bring it under control? And I have invented something that I call the Global Security Index as my kind of ultimate recommendation of what we need. We need something that not only tells the news media what's important and what's not important, but we need something that tells the American public, how are we doing? Are we actually manufacturing better security and stability or not? And I have come up with this idea of a global security index, like a Dow Jones Industrial Average, which would take the events of the day and all of our newfound skills in the areas of artificial intelligence and big data analysis to be able to churn the events that are going on all over the planet and assign a positive or negative security implication to each event, so that the outcome would be that for Norway or Malawi or the United States or the globe as a whole, you would be able to say that today we're safer than we were yesterday, if even by like small percentage points. And then over a week, you would be able to see more clearly whether or not the world was becoming safer or less safe. And then over year, you would see it even more clearly as to whether the United States and other countries have become safer, more stable, more secure, whether their health, their economy, all aspects of what we define as security have improved or not. And then you would be able to say, well, wait a minute here, even empirically, we're not getting any better. So if we're not doing the right things that are making us safer, then maybe we need to have different approaches. But that tool, that basic tool that says, are we getting any safer through our warring activity, it doesn't exist. It really doesn't exist. It doesn't exist at the top secret level inside the CIA. It doesn't exist in any think tank. It doesn't exist in the financial world, et cetera. And if you think of the stock market as the example, and it is a good example, it's not a given. One day a company can report that it made X number of dollars, it made more profit, and its stock goes down. And the reason is, well, it didn't make as much money as the analysts predicted that it would make. Or something else happened bad today, like Joe Biden discussed a new capital gains tax, and so therefore all corporate America freaks out and the stock market goes down. Well, you would have similar analysts looking at the world who would be able to smooth the numbers that relate to security, who would be able to apply their expertise to be able to say, well, we understand why this is happening, and they would have the tools to do so. So in the financial world, if you've ever invested or looked into investing, you can see that there are enormous tools available, mind-boggling tools, more than anyone can interpret. And that's why one analyst can say, buy this company, and another analyst can say, sell this company. Well, I think it's going to be the same thing under the Global Security Index for warfare, which is to say that ultimately you will have an integer that will tell you whether we are or are not safer, whether a country is or is not safer, whether a region is or is not safer in this minute, in this day, in this week, in this month, in this year, while at the same time a set of analysts who will be looking at that data more closely to try to understand why those numbers are or are not going up or down. And that's my concept. And I think that it's probably possible for the first time to achieve it because of big data analysis and because of artificial intelligence. And I'm kind of surprised that no one's come up with the idea first.
I think it's, if, as you said, if the measures were available, one could hold them up against claims and against reality, and that would be, a fascinating lever.
I want to make it clear, I'm not opposed to Joe Biden declaring as president, I'm withdrawing our forces from Afghanistan. I'm against the bullshit that we are, because the announcement makes it seem as if the war and the fighting is going to end, when in fact the perpetual war machine facilitates the ability to fight in Afghanistan without troops on the ground. And so while on the one hand, people should applaud the fact that Biden is at least saying, if we don't withdraw now, when is it going to be the right time to withdraw? That's true. On the other hand, the whole reason why we're fighting, which is to eliminate al-Qaeda and destroy the Taliban, have now been given up. And as Americans, we should ask our leaders, well, what about accountability then for this? What about a reckoning as to why we fought for 20 years and didn't achieve the goals that we started with? And I feel like we're so far from that, probably because we really don't have any methodical measure, because everyone who is part of this machine, and that includes much of Washington, much of the national security establishment, much of the establishment, they flourish regardless of whether we're doing good or bad in warfare. They flourish. And, I love to point out that 15 of the 20 wealthiest counties in the United States are all clustered in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. That's been a fundamental shift in the wealth in the country that has occurred in the last 20 years.
Yeah, they never had a housing crisis in that
or
region.
any other crisis for that matter, because everybody goes home in a limousine, as Paul Newman once said in The Color of Money.
Well, we have time for questions if viewers are sending them in. And we also have more things to talk about too.
Excellent. Yes. Oh, so fascinating. It's just like, it just boggles my mind. It's boggling. So Jacques Guillotin, who says, may be a friend of yours, Bill. Bill postulates towards the end of his book that an index to determine terrorist threat level is affixed to our perpetual war. How does that stop the military machine of the U.S. from wanting to continue spending taxpayer money going to war with foreign entities?
Well, it's Jacques Guillotin.
I knew I was going to mess his name up.
I think that in addition to the Global Security Index, I identify greater civilian involvement as the key to bringing this system under some degree of control. And I say two things that are important and really, I think, are cogent even today and important. And that is that, one, we need to have strong civilian leaders and civilian control over the military, and we don't really have that. There is a retired general who is the Secretary of Defense, and it's a shame that Joe Biden couldn't find a civilian, an actual civilian, to lead the Defense Department with civilian aesthetics and civilian specialties and civilian capabilities. This is a career military man who's in charge of the Defense Department. That's not what was intended in our Constitution or in our system of government. And second, I say that there is a need for there to be better civic education in our country, that we need to have people need to learn more about the way government works. They need to understand better the history. And I have two kids who have been through the American school system, and they learn nothing about government and nothing about history. And we really need to change that. I feel like it's not just relevant to war. It's relevant to coronavirus. It's relevant to racism. It's even to understand what a police force is, why it's under the control of the local community, what's the difference between the National Guard and the Army, what's the power of the state versus the power of the federal government. Today, the Department of Homeland Security announced an initiative that it's going to spend $1 billion on fighting climate change. The Department of Homeland Security, created to fight terrorism. And that tells you that everywhere in government, the activity is the activity, and most people don't understand it. And so therefore we don't have the tools, we don't have the capability of actually influencing what the government does. Yeah. And so to me, civic education and civilian control of the military are essential.
Well, and its citizens don't really, because that civic thing is a huge problem in the school system, that citizens don't understand their own government.
They don't understand their own government, and on top of it, fewer and fewer people are exposed to the military in our society. And the result of fewer and fewer people being exposed to the military in our society is that there are fewer and fewer civilians who are capable of going toe-to-toe with the military.
Right. Is there, and this is just off my head, is there, because the military, though, for young men and women who have no other options or have limited options, the military seems to be an avenue for a great number of younger, graduates from high school that don't go off to college. If there's, does that play into this at all?
Well, I'll resist calling you dumb,
okay,
but it's important that we know the facts. So the Army and the Marine Corps needs about 100,000 people a year to fill vacancies, if you will, in the military. They need to recruit 100,000 people. That's 100,000 people out of 24 million 18 to 24-year-olds in America. And you know the reality? They can't make their recruiting goals. They haven't been able to do so. The Army hasn't been able to do so for the last 5 years. So they spend almost $8 billion a year on bonuses in order to attract people to join the military. And today's military, of course, requires people who have technical skills. They're not only looking for riflemen to join the military today, they're looking for people who have the ability to operate complex machinery and complex IT systems. So even our picture of the opportunity which is provided for those who join the military is wrong. That machine has changed so much in the last 20 years as well. And there are fewer and fewer young people where the military is an avenue for advancement. And that, to me, also presents opportunities, which is to say, if we believe that there should be a system of national service, then let's employ those people in actually fixing the infrastructure of the country or improving our public health system. I mean, haven't we learned in the last year that we need that more than we need a military? And yet, at the same time, we're swamped by both the legacy and the reality of the power of the Pentagon, in that not only does it suck up all the resources, but it also sucks up the resources of our hearts, in the sense that we believe that the military is more important and more essential than it actually is, and we believe that it can do more than it actually can.
Well, because then, I mean, I'm a public, it's that public perception and what they're feeding us as somebody that's just sitting in Carlsbad, you know, and what, you know, we need the military to be safe, you know, we need that to keep me safe. That's what my, you know.
Yeah.
Oh, so Kathy Robbins. So regarding the index, Global Security Index, what steps might be taken to create and maintain it?
Well, I mean, I wrote about it specifically because I wanted to sort of publicly articulate its existence. I'm hoping that smart people are going to say, wow, this is a really good idea. Let's come up with some projects to pursue it. Ironically, I know this maybe contradicts what I said earlier, but the Pentagon is throwing around an enormous amount of money right now into the world of big data and artificial intelligence. And so some smart academic institution, I hope, is going to take some of that money and say, let's actually apply these big data machines to a useful project, a useful outcome, not just, you know, how do we better look at drone video and how do we better interpret the Niagara of intelligence that comes into the American military? Let's actually use it for good. So I think that I would like to see, you know, more public exposure of this idea. And then I think to try to form a coalition with academic and Silicon Valley types who might be thinking about big data and thinking about the ethical and social implications of big data, and then therefore might be interested in a project in which they would say to themselves, wow, we have this opportunity to apply big data towards something that's actually useful for the country. And that will be an attractive project. And I feel somewhat optimistic because I started to think about the Global Security Index years ago. And either I'm the stupidest guy on the planet and nobody else has taken on that idea because it's dumb, or it's a really good idea and nobody has kind of figured out yet how to do it. And so I'm hoping it's the latter.
Exactly.
Bill,
Dave, do you have more questions? Because that's it on the Facebook thing. So you got a final question before we close it out here?
Well, I was just going to say, it sounds like a good idea to me. And it actually, maybe there's a model here with respect to climate change, at least in my world of teaching undergraduates and graduate students. More and more students are coming in with really sophisticated understandings of the ecology, the biology, the chemistry, the physics that go into climate change. And at the same time, they're very curious about the social, political, economic features of it as well. And they want to do it all. And they're learning this because there are really good empirical measures of climate change. It still has a long way to go. But if we just had some metrics, some measures, and we also had the possibility to study the military as an institution. We study many institutions. This could go a long way.
Yeah, well, I think that climate change is a good example. It's like the opposite of the war on drugs, which is activity with no outcome. Climate change is actually looking at something that's very long-term, but looking at it in a very holistic way, that we need to change everything about our industry, about how we create power, about its impact directly and indirectly on the weather and on other, on basically the food we eat, the air we breathe, the climate that we live in. And it is a really good example of where there's a kind of intuitive, sophisticated understanding on the part of normal people that climate change, is affected by all of these disparate dynamics. And we have no equivalent in terms of civilian understanding of the military. And not only that, but it also is the case at the same time that the Pentagon, as such a powerful institution, eats a lot of resources that would otherwise could be given to the study of greater security for the planet, which right now at the macro level means climate change, improving the situation vis-a-vis climate change. But in the short term, we're not going to get there unless we stop the wars and take some of that power and resources away from the Pentagon and kind of make this adjustment of what's important and what's not important. You know, last year, I thought when COVID really became a crisis for our country, that I was detecting for the first time a lot of national security experts and others saying, wow, maybe we're like putting resources into the wrong thing, that we should be putting more resources into public health and fewer resources into national security. And that really persisted for quite a while. And you even had like the bigwigs of the national security world saying we need to invest more in public health. And then the riots started after George Floyd's death, and it all went away because countering the riots became a homeland security, became a national security matter, and it started to raise the questions about intelligence and surveillance and the role of the police and defunding the police and the role that Homeland Security plays in the National Guard, et cetera. And then all of a sudden, all these national security experts who had just weeks earlier been talking about reordering the resources of our society to put more emphasis on public health, they were back in their comfortable seats of national security, and it's been only of national security ever since. So I think that, you know, maybe it'll be the case that a combination of President Biden's infrastructure plan and his emphasis on climate change is going to begin to reorder those priorities, but these are very clever systems. And as I said today, when the Homeland Security Department says we're totally for climate change, they're also saying we're not going to give up any of our money. And the Pentagon similarly has become gaga for climate change as well. So I think that it is a battle between civilian and military. It is a battle between civilian needs and military needs. And probably coronavirus gave us an example of what happens when we don't invest in public health and don't use our intelligence systems to provide us with early warning, don't use our government in order to do prevention. And I would hope that the long-term outcome would be that we would put more emphasis and money into public health. I'm not optimistic about that, but I certainly think that in the long term, that's going to be the battle that we're going to fight.
Great place to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So, David, for people who are watching, where would people, do you do any social media, or do you have a website that people can go to if they want to find out any more about you?
So I do tweet under Warkin, WARKIN, and through that you can get to my other social media. I write regularly for Newsweek, and you can go to Newsweek and you can find my articles. And I do a lot of this. And so I know that this talk will be posted on YouTube eventually, as our other book talks. And I do a ton of podcasts, and I'm doing them right now. And so certainly if you want the Bill Arkin Show, it's ongoing.
It's out there.
But beyond that, you know, I think these ideas of civic engagement, civic education, there are organizations that are now pushing this more. And certainly I encourage anyone who's listening to understand better how to look at the news and ask themselves basic questions about why are we fighting? What are we getting out of it? And those kinds of questions are ultimately the ones that are going to cut through to the day-to-day to be able to get to the deeper conclusions.
So with that, what's the avenue for the average citizen to take that question? State representative? Where do you take that question?
I do think that Congress has basically dropped the ball on both oversight and control of the purse. They did it when they essentially gave up the right to be the only institution under the Constitution that can declare war. And so it really does boil down to the Congress sort of restoring the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. But beyond that, there should also be, you know, more of an attempt to push the news media into covering important things. And that means that people should spend less time watching and paying attention to unimportant things in the news media, because I can tell you as a veteran of television, the data exists every single day to show what people are watching. And when everybody is watching the stupid show, then it is very much a commodity that increases in value. And putting on the boring show about war or anything else becomes less valuable. So when people make the decision, even in their little home right here in North County, to not watch the 24-hour news cycle, trust me, they see it.
Mhm.
They know it. There has been a significant decline in viewership at Fox and MSNBC since Donald Trump has left the scene. They know it. And unfortunately, their approach is going to be, well, we're going to make it even bloodier and louder and bigger headlines and create controversy in order to get people back watching. But the truth of the matter is that when you vote with your eyes and you vote with your reading, you're actually having an impact on what the news media produces.
Yeah, because it's sort of, you were talking about the military machine. It's like they're in the news media and the media. It's like their job is to survive, however,
And make money.
and make money. And so however they need to do that, they will do that.
Yeah.
David, for you, you got a website or something where people can find you?
People can find me at University of California, San Diego. I teach in the anthropology department there, and I have a abiding interest in the U.S. military. And in an earlier time, we used to call it the national security state. And I still continue that line of research and working with students. And yeah, I can be found.
You can be found
via there. That would be the easiest.
Excellent. Hey, Bill, do you do your own podcast, or are you just a guest on people's podcasts?
No, I'm a guest on other people's podcasts. I don't understand the whole podcasting thing, and I don't really understand. There's so many now that it's even impossible to choose. So
yeah.
But it's a great device of citizen journalism, and I think that it certainly shows that there is a desire for different kinds of voices, and that's positive. And so therefore, if I'm asked by the left or I'm asked by the right, I don't care. I'll go on anybody's podcast and debate it out. And that's what people need to do. They need to seek out independent media. They need to seek out new voices. And and again, thank you to Warwick's for having this, sponsoring this event. And thanks, Dave, for moderating. And and hopefully the weather will be nicer in the next few days, and I can get back to shelling.
You can walk across the street to the beach, right? Yes, with that, I'm going to say goodnight to Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching. So thank you both. Thank you, Dave and Bill, for being here. It was a great conversation. Got lots of great comments in the Facebook thing.
Thanks.
Thank you, Julie.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks, Bill. Have a nice evening.